So before I begin, I want to make one sort of qualification first. Now, when we enter higher education, and especially at an undergraduate context, when we encounter these words, sources, plagiarism, and citation, for an early undergraduate student, one of the concerns is very practical, right? It's about learning the technicalities of citation, learning the protocols, learning, what the format is, for in-text citation, for end-text citation, and you start looking up, the MLA handbook. So many of you would be using MLA if you're in English departments. But today, of course, we are using Chicago and APA, depending on which discipline and which institution you're working in. So, so that is sort of the aspect of learning protocols. And that is not what I will go into so much. However, I do want to flag it off before I begin. So as all of you know, that if you want to sort of learn the protocols of, MLA citation, you have very, very useful sources today, right? Which was not really present even perhaps, a decade back. Today, you have multiple sources, one of them being the Purdue Online Writing Lab. And I'll share a set of resources with all of you after this session to help you sort of learn all these protocols. And, you will get the guidelines, you will get explanations. And even if you think that this is a little tedious, I'm not able to get my head around it, this is in fact not the difficult bit, right? And I'd ask you to trust me on this. This is not the difficult bit. The difficult bit is not to learn the protocol. You can learn sort of the convention that, okay, you use the author's surname followed by the page number when you do in-text citation. And for end-text citation, there's another convention. We'll touch upon that, later in the presentation too. But the difficult bit is something else. The difficult bit is to understand why to use a source, where to use a source, and how to use a source, right? The difficult bit is to try to understand which sources are more important for you, right? It's to understand how to incorporate the source in your argument, right? So there are lots of sources you are reading, but how do you put it into your argument within a paragraph, right? Within sentences. So those are some of the things we'll reflect on. Now, as already has been mentioned, the spirit of this workshop is collaborative and participatory. So we are mostly going to reflect and discuss rather than me sort of lecturing you. So there'll be lots of exercises, and I would strongly encourage you to put down your responses on chat. And, at some points you can also raise your hand and speak. Okay, okay, so on that note, I will begin. Now we'll begin with the sort of broad question. So I want you to just think about this question for a second. What is a source, right? Think of the first words or phrases that come to your head and put it down on the chat box. Can you do that? So if I ask you, what is a source? What would be some of the basic, definitions or ideas about a source you have? Okay. Information, that's a good word. Reference, text. The originating point, literally, it is the origin of, let's say, a knowledge that provides us with something, okay? But that's something you're not defining here. So it could be a piece, it could be information, could be a fact, could be a perspective. It's a lead, right? That it leads you into certain directions, okay? Sometimes you may not even know your destination. You're saying that leads us to a destination, but sometimes it's a discovery, it's an exploration, right? As part of a journey. It's the root of an argument, or I would say it's one root of an argument. There could be many other roots. Hints to solve the problem. Okay, so these are all great words and great metaphors, right? Hint, root, information, lead. If I may add, a cue, right? A clue, right? But to sort of organize that, the idea of a source is simply, a source is any information or knowledge that you gather from another text or a text, right? Any information or knowledge that you gather from a text is a source using which you develop more knowledge, you respond to it, or you summarize it, you represent it, and so on and so forth, right? And we know that any knowledge that we have is always encapsulated or contained in sources, right? So it's not that knowledge is just floating around, right? If you have to use a metaphor, think of it in terms of blocks or boxes, right? And there are multiple boxes. Some of them are encyclopedias, some of them are books in libraries, some of them are people, right? But basically every element or that sort of contains knowledge or gives you knowledge becomes a source that you use. So that's a very basic sort of starting point. Now, along with that, I also want to sort of talk about what is the spirit in which we think about sources, right? So we have the technical definition of source. But as Professor Mangalam was also saying, we have to think about sources as organizing knowledge of the universe. So, I have, the sort of an image of, the sky and stars for a reason, because as we know that we share this world and this universe together, right? We, we have languages that we share together. Now, using those languages, we are representing and creating different types of knowledge. Now, any knowledge that you have or I have, right, is necessarily gathered from somebody else. In that sense, it's not that on my own, I have some sort of, let's say, an exclusive knowledge at any point, because language is common. Language is not exclusive, right? Now, I may create my own language, of course, but as soon as it's shared, language is common. So in other words, let's think of using sources in the sense of a grand collaboration. We are always collaborating and conversing, right, with other people and other knowledges. So rather than thinking about using sources in a competitive spirit, let's think of it in a collaborative spirit. And the idea of acknowledgement is important because it's just recognizing very humbly that, I gathered my knowledge from somebody else. Now, with that spirit and purpose in mind, let's move on to thinking about how do we approach, right, the question of using sources. Now, if some of you came for the previous workshop, I followed this, approach where I said, okay, for a moment, let's forget that, you know about a lot of these traditions and discourses, and let's sort of think of the fundamental starting points that we can have. Similarly, what I'm going to ask you to do now is to imagine that you have not come to the university, let's say, right? Suppose, you think of a period when you were in school, or think of people, let's say, who have not ever gone to the university. Are they not using sources? Are they not citing? Are they not reflecting on sources? Now, I would argue that they are, and you are, right? You are always using sources and thinking about sources. So we're going to start with a couple of general, sort of frameworks from which we'll think about how we are using sources. And from that, we'll specifically move into the question of using sources in academic context. Now, the first idea is that sources shape our opinions and beliefs, right? What does that mean? Now, let's think of certain facts or certain, let's say, conventions, certain values that we hold, which today we hold to be true or, generalizably true, or something that most people would perhaps agree on, right? Now, let's think of this statement: the earth is spherical in shape. It's, of course, roughly spherical. But all of you, would have heard of it or thought about it. What do you think are the sources? Like, it as general knowledge. But for a moment, if you think of what are the sources through which I've gathered this general knowledge, you will start thinking of very concrete, texts. You would think of, let's say, school textbooks, right? Where this sort of fact would be represented at different levels. This could be science textbooks, geography textbooks. It could be, of course, media. And here media would refer to, television. It could refer to, today, of course, the internet. It could refer to cinema, through which you have also visualized, the earth as a sphere, which is why I also put down this, icon and image in front of you. You may have found it in encyclopedias, right? Even before you found it in a school textbook, you may have sort of seen it in an encyclopedia with an illustration. Now, of course, what is being represented in the school textbook is also being produced within traditions of astronomy, and this sort of can be traced back to a very long time ago, right? And there are multiple traditions in the, there are Indic traditions, there are Western traditions of astronomy within which, people are conceptualizing the Earth as a sphere, right? I mean, we attribute it to, Newton usually, but of course, there's a longer tradition where people are already kind of speculating and approximating the shape of Earth. And of course, in a contemporary sense that you would find in scientific journals, right? Now, maybe 100 years from now, maybe, many years from now, somebody has a new proposal for how we should define the shape of the Earth by saying that, no, we need a much more precise, metaphor for it. And that knowledge begins to be produced then in scientific journals, which then filters into, let's say, textbooks and so on and so forth. So, right? So this is how you've gathered, let's say, what you consider to be a more objective fact, about the shape of the Earth. But let's think of something a little more subjective, which has to do with a convention, which has to do with a value, right, that we hold and agree on. One should respect their elders. Now, how is it that you arrive at, a belief or an agreement or an understanding of this statement? Now, again, now think of the sources from which this is being generated. This is being generated from family, of course. Right from the outset, you hear family members saying it, right? And again, it may be said by particular family members, but it's held to be true across families. So if you think of the family as an institution, right, and you think of, okay, in your neighborhood, there are, let's say, 20 different families, you find that this value is being, represented and talked about in different families, right? You find it, of course, in media. You will watch films. I mean, I know that, when I was young and I watched Hindi films or I watched Bengali films, I saw this visualized. I saw, that people, were respecting their elders. And through that, I gathered, an understanding. You will find this in moral studies textbooks or value education textbooks, which could be in your school, which also could be, textbooks that, your parents bought for you. Sometimes these are also religious texts. Of course, when we think of, this value system, this is also something that has been represented through religious myths and traditions. We might also find this in children's literature, right? So as a child, I discovered this sort of idea in a lot of children's literature that I was reading. So in other words, this sort of statement is also something that is sourced from a bunch of texts that I'm being exposed to, that I'm reading, that I'm seeing, and so on and so forth. Now, with this sort of broad framing in mind of how different social assumptions and beliefs that we have are derived from sources, right? Let's do this exercise. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to give you, a statement, and I want you to tell me, what do you think are the sources which may have established the truth of the statement? Now, we may not agree with it, right? In fact, the first two, right? The first two statements I personally disagree with, right? However, if we think about it, these are social conventions or these are statements that a lot of people hold to be true, right? Now, let's take the first one. British English is more sophisticated. What do you think are the sources which may have established this idea that British English is more? Okay, British TV shows, that's great. Gopal said something ironic. Someone long time ago had inferiority complex. Okay, we'll come to that, Gopal. Colonization, all right. English grammar lessons, very good. Interaction, that's a bit vague, like interaction between whom? Eurocentrism. Britishers are more respected. Okay, so can we think of institutions also? So you've talked about English grammar lessons, okay. Texts and interviews, all right. Accent missionaries, all right, that's good. All right, so let's take some of your responses. British TV shows and let's say British culture that you've been exposed to, right? Now, I don't know if, some of you may have come across this TV show. It's from a very long time back. It's called, Mind Your Language. And it's supposed to be a, funny TV show, but it's a show where a bunch of diasporic, communities, and they are, let's say, Indian, Pakistani, Italian, French, and so on. They're in England and they are learning English. And this entire show's comedy is about how they're getting their accents wrong, right? And the teacher is really trying to teach them a proper English. Now, we know that this sort of a mentality has also been present because of colonization, because of, let's say the rise of convent schooling. This kind of a convention has also been present in English-speaking institutes in India, right? Today, of course, things are changing as we talk more about Indian Englishes. And from there, the whole idea, what is a good accent? What is a powerful accent? The other thing to notice here is power, right? That, somebody, let's say, in a school, right? Let's say, people believe in that school that the British accent is a better accent. But if that school is an elite school, right? If that school, and Gopal, you mentioned somebody who had an inferiority complex, but let's think of it a different way. If, let's say, you have people who believe in that idea of British accent as more powerful, as more sophisticated, and those people are influencing language policy, right? And these people may be coming from more, let's say, elite, upper class, anglicized backgrounds, then this idea gets more power. As soon as it's coming from an elite institution, as soon as it's represented in language policy, it has more power, right? So, okay, so that's the first statement we thought about. Let's think about the second one. Women are more emotional. Have you heard this? I mean, I have heard this a lot, in my family settings. What do you think are the sources for this? Why do people think of this? Okay. Media, that's a very sort of important point because a lot of these ideas of gender are derived from media representation. Rosemary has said experience all the time. Okay. Society and media, literature. So literature is a very good point, right? Because again, when we think of media, we're not just thinking of visual media, but also thinking of texts. And if, let's say, those texts are coming from a certain time where, women are mostly represented as sentimental. Also remember, it's about who's writing those texts, right? So I think Rituparna said something about men who have less EQ, or I don't know, it's emotional quotient, right? Or that's what you mean, right? But let's say, in a tradition where mostly men are representing women, perhaps this is a stereotype that is being used a lot. Dr. Preeti has said something important, that there are also biological differences, right? But this is the interesting bit, right? Biology, for example, would be talking about particular, let's say, hormonal, chromosomal, neurological configurations, right? But how does that get associated with being more emotional, like feeling more of something, right? And in fact, this is work that is being done today, right? Where there are within science studies, in fact, there are people who are pointing out that even in biology, even in how, let's say, women's reproductive organs are written about, or women's, let's say, internal organs and neurology is written about, there is a certain bias in the words that are used. Let's say you would associate women with something like hysteria, right? And this sort of association is being produced from within biology and psychology too, right? Not just literature. All right. So what we find here, as soon as we say this, women are more emotional, we find that this kind of a bias or stereotype is coming from multiple disciplines, right? It's coming from literature, it's coming from biology, it may be coming from anthropology, right? Let's say people who have studied culture and experience. All right, let's look at the third one. Hard work will lead to success. Now, this is something some of you, of course, may agree with also. Okay, Ashima has said capitalism. Practical experience. This is important. So one of the sources you have is actually your first-hand experience, right? So we will call, we typically call this a primary source. That's something you're gathering from a first-hand experience. Okay, literature, autobiography, parents, very good. So you're sort of hearing it from family. Role models, that's very important. That people you look up to, again, the whole idea of power, right? Somebody who has more power and more authority begins to influence you. Results, this is also very important, that a source becomes more believable because it's proved to be true, right? So just because you say it, it doesn't become true. But if it's verified and it's proved, and we'll use this word corroborated, if other sources also say it, then we know, okay, this may be true. Now, Tanisha said law to success. Okay, so law to success. Now we will also find this statement in self-help books, right? So if you think of what are the exact books where this statement would be written, you would find it in self-help books, you would find it in management books. You might also find it to some extent in psychology, pop psychology stuff. But I want to ask a critical question here, right? Let's say you are somebody who puts in a lot of hard work, right? You go to the library every day and you put in a lot of effort. But at the same time, perhaps because of different disadvantages, maybe you didn't have an English medium schooling, and now you're learning English for the first time in higher education. Even though you put in a lot of effort, you don't see the results immediately. Now, in that moment, you might have a bias that makes you feel that, no, the statement can't be true for everybody. So the other thing to think about is that you are also reading a source through your own bias of experience, right? So that is also important to keep in mind. So a source may be true for some people, may not be true for other people. Somebody might say that this source is only true if you have more privilege. When you do not have privilege, you can't say this statement so simply, right? All right. So Dr. Pidya said, Bhagavad Gita or mythological texts or sacred texts, religious texts, right? Which will also make the statement. Now, I think you've got sort of the hang of what I'm trying to sort of do here. I'm trying to now make you think of different sort of statements, different opinions, different beliefs that you hear about, and immediately think about what are the different sources from where it's being gathered. And that becomes one of the starting points for research, to be able to intuitively identify what could be potential sources. So can we just take 2-3 minutes to do this exercise? I want you to think of any assumption or belief you have grown up hearing. And I want you to identify some of the sources, maybe 2 or 3 you can mention, which have shaped this assumption or belief. So take a minute. Okay, Tanushi believes that women cannot go to temple in periods. Can you tell me what are the sources? You can also speak.
Grandparents, like the parents teachings in the Hindu cultures, which have been made me think that you're not allowed to. But on the contrary, I think the God has made us like this, so why not? So this is something which is kind of unacceptable to me.
Okay, so religious conventions, then it's a family practice, then stereotypes with menstruation and how you associate it with, let's say, impurity, right? So all of these factors come together. Hadia, you said men aren't supposed to cry. So could you tell us what are the sources you think for this? You can speak or you can type it out. Rituparna, would you like to tell us what is the idea? Okay, so if you're writing down the statement, also point out, what are the sources. So Arushi, you have said men are stronger than women. This is something that stemmed from the patriarchal society and it's prevalent in a lot of places. Yeah, so now within patriarchal society, let's think of particular spaces or texts, where we'll find this idea. So for example, think of how sports discourse is represented. Now, this is typically a place where we'll talk about strength and fitness. And we find that in sports discourse, even among coaches, right, even among commentators, we find that these biases and stereotypes exist. Today, of course, things may be changing a little bit, but we know these biases are very strong. Second, even in, let's say, biology, we'll find that these notions are sometimes, let's say, these stereotypes may be encouraged. Yeah, Arushi, tell us.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, in the sports sector is one place. Again, in biology, it's often compared the strengths. But I feel as a biology student in school myself, I feel in biology, it's honestly the other way around, because you learn about the natural processes that go on in the bodies of women, and anybody can just change their belief and they're like, oh no, women are much stronger. So in that respect, it's a different thought process. But then again, for example, when I talk about strength, I just don't mean the physical one. Sometimes even in the, for example, corporate sectors, we regularly have these conversations about, men being paid more, men being thought of as more competent. In terms of, workplace, because for a long period of time, the olden times, women were not allowed to work. So again, that's again a belief, I guess.
Okay, I think that's a very important point, that we find that in different spaces, like let's say in the corporate sector, we'll find that there may be a discourse about, who does more valuable work that should be compensated more, who has more stamina and resilience. So all of those sort of biases go into creating this idea. Yeah, Dr. Preeti, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, sir. So when, and this is not to just put forth my point, but also when somebody says that women were not allowed to work, I just have one difference in opinion. That it's not that women were never allowed to work. In fact, it has always been women who've been working nonstop. The only difference is that they were not allowed to work outside the house, maybe. So they were always working, number one. Number two, when you say that, or somebody assumes that these presumptions, that women are not paid at par when it comes to corporate sector or other places. What I believe is that it's, when we talk about feminism or talking about discrepancy with respect to all the parameters that we have in mind, could be any number of parameters that we can talk of. I believe that she has been, very subservient, and she's been just accepting whatever came her way. But gradually, women have started saying what they wanted to say all the time, because I believe, being a woman, I believe that women always, since we are emotionally involved in all the kind of jobs that we do, we put in more efforts, with due regards to all the men around, but then we put in more efforts, not only physically, but also emotionally. We get involved with the process, with the job, with whatever tasks and responsibilities we are interested with. So I believe that women always worked, and no society can ever function without women working. So with due regards to all men across the board. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a very important point, that there is labor that we don't recognize, right? So when we say that, you're paid more or paid less, you're talking about a certain restricted idea of work. But their work involves emotional labor, it involves domestic labor, it involves different types of social labor, right? Now, what I want to point out before I move on to the next bit is that what we'll find is, we're already finding it in our discussion, that, there are, let's say, different experiences we are coming from, right? And that makes us think of this statement differently. The reason why it's important to look at different sources is to understand, one, historically, how has this notion been established? And number two, you also want to verify it. So for example, when you think of, women are not compensated enough in the workplace, right? In terms of, let's say, a financial wage. If you think of that, and there are some people who will say, no, that's not true. So then actually, then we have to do, or institutions have to do the work of researching this, right? And documenting this in order to present the point, right? All right. So thank you, everyone. I think there are lots of things here. Hadia said something about fair is equivalent to beauty, which we're getting from media, for example, all those advertisements, Fair and Lovely. Rosemary has talked about how there's an assumption that white people are racists, but this is of course coming from a certain historical understanding and historical texts, through which we understand how white people have been racist in the past. And so that's also a sort of assumption we continue to hold in the present. All right, so this is sort of the first way in which we'll think about sources. And I want to point out a few things here, just to summarize our argument. That one, as soon as we talk about sources, we're talking about power and authority. So some sources have more power because the institution has more power, right? So let's say, whether you're thinking about, educational institutions or religious institutions, or, let's say political institutions, not some of them have more power than others, right? And depending on that, a source begins to have more power. Sometimes it's about the person, Gopal, to go back to what Gopal said about, person with an inferiority complex. But it's not just that. Think about it. In academic scholarship, you want to also look at the credibility of the scholar, right? Has the scholar worked in the field sufficiently? How many publications have they done? What has been their reception? How have other people responded to them? So that is also something that is granting power and authority. Also, let's say we are thinking of which institution in terms of, let's say, if, let's say, you have a paper that's coming from, let's say you value work that is coming from, Harvard University or Chicago, let's say, right? So let's say we know that a lot of literature on South Asia comes from Chicago. And let's say you value that, you trust that because it's come from Chicago. Now, one reason you're valuing that is because you assume that the institution is more credible because they have a better peer-reviewed process. People are getting more feedback, right? There's better scholarship that is happening as a result. But what I want to say is that frequently we find that when we only think of the truth of a source on the basis of power and institution, that's also limited, right? Because many people who may be working in less powerful institutions or may have less social power may also be saying important things which we need to consider, which is why we'll move to the next sort of two aspects, which is narrative and bias, right? So every source, for example, has to be also understood within an argument. So just because somebody writes from Harvard or publishes in a top journal, I don't know if you've heard of this guy called Alan Sokal. So look up this the Sokal hoax, right? Somebody called Sokal. He actually published a paper in a very prime, critical theory journal, but it turned out to be a hoax, right? He completely faked it. And he wanted to just show that you can also get past, these, big journals just by sort of using a certain language. So don't just trust, right, the power of the institution or also read the argument, see if it's logically coherent, see if it's persuasive, right? Also think of the biases from which it might be said. Today, we know that, in the discipline of history, for example, we know that history can be written from the perspective of the victor, from dominant communities. It can be written from the perspective of marginalized communities, right? Today, we know that, there are different narratives about how, let's say, some rulers, let's say there's this debate on, okay, was Aurangzeb a tyrannical ruler or was he a just ruler in the time that he was living in? Right? So you find that people are sort of working with different biases, and it's important for you as a reader to look at multiple sources before you arrive at your judgment, right? Don't just sort of fall for, one source, right? And finally, think about the discipline. Think about, let's say, whether, the source is from psychology or history, because each of them have the different methods and they're saying different things. Right? Let's say what a psychological experiment can say is something that, let's say, a historical study wouldn't say. A historical study would look at sources in the past, right? It would look at archives and try to understand each of these points that you're talking about. Whereas psychological experiment, let's say, would work with people in the present and understand their mental states. So each source is also coming from a different discipline and they take you to different directions. All right. Now, with these sort of thoughts in mind, let's move on to the next section. And now we start thinking about the writing of sources, right? And, again, what Professor Mangalam was saying at the beginning, right, about acknowledging sources. So how do we think about that? Now let's sort of first think of a more general case before we think about academic context. Suppose you have gone to a social gathering, right? There are two people who are having a conversation. And these two people say slightly different things. So one person says, hey, I think the more sources you use, the more valid your argument will be. And another person says, but in a 500-word essay, I can't use 20 sources, come on. Maybe this is a conversation some of you have heard or already had before. Now, we are the third person here, in the yellow blob, right? Who's just like, standing there thinking, okay, what do I say? So another sort of way you think about sources is you are becoming part of a conversation, right? Through sources. And you're doing it every day. You are entering into conversations which other people are already having. Or sometimes you are starting a conversation, but then other people are joining. And you are responding to what others are saying. But you are responding by taking into account what they're saying, right? By acknowledging what they're saying. To get better at using sources, you have to get better at conversation, in other words, right? And to get better at conversation, you learn to listen better. You learn to acknowledge what others are saying. And of course, you use those sources to develop your own thought. For example, what I might say here, so one person is saying that the more sources you use, the more valid your argument will be. Second person says, but in a 500-word essay, I can't cite 20 sources, come on. And combining them, I have a perhaps slightly more nuanced idea, which is that using more sources can help validate the smaller details in an argument, which is taking from what the first person is saying. But in a short essay, it might be more useful to focus on fewer details and prioritize the use of the most important sources, right? So I took these two partial ideas and put it together to form a slightly more complex idea, right? And this is precisely what happens in a conversation. Now, maybe, the first person says something else, second person says something else, and the conversation keeps developing as a result. Now, there are two things to think about before we move to the exercise. In this scenario, we want to ensure two things: that the source needs to be accurately represented. Now, this is where we horribly go wrong, right? We go wrong in speech and we go wrong in our writing. We are not listening well enough. We are not reading very observantly and noticing the argument. So if some of you came for the previous workshop, you know this, right? You miss details in an argument. So the first is source needs to be accurately represented. So very calmly listen to the source and understand what it is. Second, the sources need to be coherently synthesized in an argument. So it's not just about knowing the sources. Now you're putting it together in a sentence that makes sense, right? Or maybe 2 sentences, 3 sentences, whatever. But you're putting it together in your own response, which is coherent. So keeping that in mind, let's look at how the response that I showed you, how that could have gone in other directions. So let's say this is the response I used, where I accurately summarized both the sources, and I also added a little detail from my end, and I coherently put it together. But suppose I had said using too many sources is too cluttered and may confuse the reader, as to which source is more valid. Now here there is an unclear use of the two sources, right? One source is talking about how using sources can help validate the argument, but I have not represented that. I've said something entirely different here, right? My point may be coherent, but I haven't coherently or I haven't accurately used the sources. That's the first problem. The second problem is that, let's say I say using more sources validates the argument and helps select the best sources for a short essay. Now read it again. Using more sources validates the argument and helps select the best sources for a short essay. And now you're thinking, if using more sources validates the argument, how does it help select the best sources for a short essay? So this connection feels abrupt. It's random, right? So here, what has happened is, even if I have used the ideas from the sources, I have put it together in a manner that is incoherent, right? So it's an unclear argument. So you have to pay attention to both, represent the sources accurately, use it coherently in an argument. Now it's your turn. So this is your, these are your sentences. Imagine you have entered a social gathering. One person says, plagiarism is like stealing someone's ideas. We need to strictly punish students who plagiarize. Other person says, but will that change anything? Students often plagiarize since they don't understand the citation protocols, or they feel the pressure to imitate a standard academic language, right? So two different ideas about plagiarism. You are standing there. What would your response be? So take a minute and try to write a sentence. So take your time, don't rush it. Write a sentence that can represent both these arguments or parts of both these arguments and put it together in an idea.
Please repeat, what do we have to write?
So as I sort of showed you in the previous example, did you understand that? Like you have come to a social gathering and let's say one person is saying this, plagiarism is like stealing someone's ideas. We need to strictly punish students who plagiarize. Let's say the next person says, but will that change anything? Students often plagiarize since they don't understand the citation protocols or they feel the pressure to imitate a standard academic language. Now you will respond by using both these ideas in your response. Is that clear? Yeah. So come up with a sentence or maybe two sentences if that's comfortable. Yeah, Dr. Preeti, you have the sentence ready already?
Yes, sir. With your permission, just one thing I wish to say, that you should not punish the student right away because we need to first train the students in a particular format.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what you can mention in your sentence. So the idea.
All right, fine.
The idea is a scenario. So imagine a scenario where people are saying this.
Right.
Now, what would you respond? Keeping both the sources in your response.
All right. So may I come up with that?
Yeah. Can we maybe wait for a minute?
Okay. Fine. Sure.
Yeah. So imagine you're speaking to these two people, but using both their arguments in your response, like I showed you with the previous example. We have some responses coming in. So Spandana has said, plagiarism is not a practice that should be encouraged. However, since they're new to the research field, we cannot punish them right away. We should rather be giving them workshops or training where they have time to learn and better themselves. All right, so you have broadly responded to the two arguments, but perhaps you could have also incorporated more of the second argument, right? Like the details of it. Because the second argument said something about why students plagiarize. What are some other reasons? Sanskriti, you have said plagiarism doesn't mean stealing ideas, as people might have the same ideas or might agree with the idea stolen. It's important to represent the idea on your own terms with a new perspective without blindly copying it as it is. All right. But again, what I would say is like you are responding to both. So you're taking into account both the sources, but you are perhaps mentioning one source, the words of one source more than the other. So that's something to keep in mind. Sandhya, plagiarism is like stealing someone's ideas, but if students are taught about ethics and citing sources, it would be more enlightening and useful. All right. Rosemary, students carry on plagiarizing because they know that the penalty is not severe and not strictly imposed by the teachers and the administration. So here, Rosemary, you have responded to the first person, I think, a lot more directly. So what we are trying to get better at is that in a conversation, there may be 3 different people. Now, of course, you can't always respond to all of them together. But can we try to sort of incorporate all of their points in what we are sort of responding? Vaishnavi, plagiarism is like copying someone's thoughts, but what choice do we have when someone agreed to that particular idea? All right. Gopal, plagiarism is a serious offense and should be punishable, but we must take into account the experience the writer has, their understanding of sources and citations. They may be a student still learning to use the protocol and they may feel pressure to follow it to a T, but ultimately missing the mark. All of this must be taken into account while deciding the punishment, warning to the learner, harsher to the veteran. So this is something that actually, because I think Gopal wrote in multiple sentences, Gopal was able to, I think, put together, the different points in the 2 sources in this. Okay. So Dr. Preeti has, I don't think it's correct to punish students who plagiarize, rather training them appropriately and regularly would serve the purpose. Plagiarism happens due to pressure to conform to the standards. All right, great. So you are sort of now getting the hold of this exercise, right? So you're beginning to sense that this is sort of the basic principle that we are using in conversations, but of course we don't always, converse in such a formal way. But this is a principle we can use in conversations, but we can also then go on to use it in academic writing. And we'll move to the next sort of part. And here, what I'm trying to show is that just by keeping this principle in mind, we can more easily and effectively start sort of doing academic citations. So let's imagine that source 1 is written, let's say the name or the surname of source 1 is S1. And suppose it's written in page 5 of some book or some paper, right? Source 2, it's S2, named S2, and it's page 37. Now I have sort of tried to put it in my response where I've also cited it, right? So should plagiarism necessarily invite strict punishment as SI has insisted? Now here, I'm beginning my argument with this question or premise, right? Should plagiarism necessarily invite strict punishment? But this idea I have sourced from SI 5, right? So in the MLA format, since I've already mentioned SI here, I can just say 5. The causes of plagiarism may be more complex than we think, right? Now, I am sort of presenting my kind of view or argument here. For example, and to illustrate that point, students often plagiarize, and here what I'm doing is I'm directly quoting. So while to use the first source I paraphrased, here I'm directly quoting. Students often plagiarize since they feel the pressure to imitate a standard academic language. Again, I've used in-text citation. In such a situation, I'm concluding, we need to rethink how we institutionally discuss plagiarism. Right? It's not that I've said anything more, perhaps this is just the introduction. And now I'll go on to talk about how we need to rethink. But as you can see, just this exercise gives you sort of the literacy or the skill you require in order to start putting together sources in an academic argument. Now, so we'll take like a break, but before we take a break, I just want to have a discussion for 2 minutes, which is about plagiarism, because the next part will be about citation. Okay, maybe we'll take 5 more minutes and then we'll take a break. So this is just a convention for in-text citation, what I had done in the previous slide. So, we typically, so what you need to always keep in mind is that when you're citing anything, for in-text citation, there is some information you need in your mind, right? So you need the author's surname, the page numbers from where the quote or argument has been borrowed, the year of publication, the article or source title, because sometimes it may be a video, not an article. And you sort of put it together according to different conventions. So in MLA, if you have the page number, if it's an essay, you just use the surname and then the page number, right? Without any comma. Now, before we move on to the next part, where we'll talk about, techniques of citing and how we can get better at citation, just like a small reflection. And this is being anticipated from the previous conversation about how we think of plagiarism. What do you think are the reasons for plagiarism? So of course, one of the reasons is, let's say, it's your lack of integrity. Let's say, so it is an individual problem in that you are, you are copying somebody's words, fully knowing it. You fully know that you're copying somebody's words, but you just want to pass it off as your own. So it's a lack of integrity, and we look at it as unethical behavior. But what are some of the other reasons? Unethical behavior, haste to complete, peer pressure, right? Lack of training. So this is a very extensive list. Lack of guidance and counseling, lack of adequate emphasis on research, right? Rosemary, you have mentioned something very interesting, which is that there are also apps now which helps you paraphrase, right? Where student copy information from sources and it puts it into that app, and the app will present it as in your own language. So Subir, you have said that institutions may also encourage plagiarism. That's also something to think about, right? Like, because, who are the scholars we are reading? Who are the people who are teaching us, right? What about their integrity? So that's something to also think about. So there are a bunch of different issues, but what we sort of, Vaishnavi has said something very important, not knowing what plagiarism is, right? So you don't know what is the difference between putting it in double quotes and paraphrasing. Let's say you don't know the difference between, where to use the quote and where not to use the quotes, right? So all of these different things come into play. Now, what I want to point out, and this is based on a lot of the research that is being done on plagiarism. Now, unfortunately, there's not so much research that is being done in India. I think India is very, fertile ground. It's an important space where this research should happen. But there's been a lot of research that's been done in non-English speaking contexts, or contexts where people are beginning to learn English in academic writing. And these are some of the reasons, right? Sort of three sort of broad reasons that come up. So one is the whole idea of how when you come into the university, it's an adjustment to a new writing practice. So as Shweta was saying, let's say you are used to copying, right? In school. In school, you were always told to, let's say, just copy down the answer. I remember, I used to get very high marks in history, not because I understood, but because I memorized everything. Like I memorized the entire textbook, and I would write the answer, get great marks, and forget all about it, right? So let's say when you come to the university, you're being told, no, you have to engage in critical thinking. But unfortunately, that adjustment is not smooth, especially when we are not having discussions about it and learning the different techniques. Then another problem, and that's more at a pedagogic and institutional level also, which is assessment design, right? So let's say if the assessment design is not explained well enough, right? Or if the assessment design is so standardized that it's very generic, and for years people are writing the same, responding to the same assignment prompt, then what happens is that you just borrow what others have said. So if you get a broad question, let's say critically analyze this poem, you might just look up some, Spark Notes or some internet sources and perhaps, say that, okay, I'll plagiarize it. But what if the assessment asks you to reflect on your own emotions? Then it's not giving you a scope to plagiarize, right? So this is also one of the reasons we have to keep in mind. Or for that matter, even if you're told to critically analyze a poem, what does critical analysis mean? What are the steps you need to take? How do you need to organize your answer? So without that information, you are just trying to imitate somebody else. Then of course, a culture of rote learning. Let's say we have been conditioned from a younger age to, again, memorize and learn. And while memorizing is very important and very useful, it may also create habits where you find it difficult to, let's say, generate your own responses sometimes. So I will now conclude this part, and I'll just sort of reiterate the approaches I was trying to tell you. So one is to think about sources as part of conversations we're always having. And in fact, training yourself to listen better to acknowledge the different sources around you. And when you're responding consciously, recognizing them, referring to them, and that helps you, right, adjust to sort of the practice of citation. It also helps you generate your own responses rather than just listening and repeating what others are saying, right? And the second is to also think about how any opinion or judgment, right, anything you hear, it's being derived from sources. So start thinking about what are those sources, where are they coming from, right? What we're going to focus on in the next part is to think of, how do we approach citation? And it's really about argumentation and developing our ideas. So once we start thinking of citation from the perspective of argumentation, of presenting ideas, and not from, let's say, the perspective of how do we sound smart, how do we show that there are so many sources, that is transformative, right? And just as we were thinking of engaging in a conversation and how citation is actually part of engaging in a conversation, let's think of how do we engage in an academic conversation. Now, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at 3 different ideas to help understand how we can think more critically about sources. So the first is, in your sort of, in your learning to cite, you first have to identify, how citations can build arguments. Why would citations be, required for an argument? The second is, once you've identified that, oh, citations are required, then what you do is also study the source, right? And this is where you can try to understand, is this source relevant? Is this pertinent? Now, of course, when you're doing a hurried job, then you just take whatever source you find and put it in. But we are not trying to do that. If you're doing research work, and we are not talking about hurried assignments that you're writing, we're talking about research work where you have enough time, and where, let's say, at least you're getting like a week, a couple of weeks to work on it. So then you would also read up some sources, right? And you would also look up these sources, who the authors are, where it is published, and through that generate some knowledge about the validity, the reliability of the source, and whether the source is relevant to your writing. And finally, and this is important, you then need to put together the source. You need to use the source in your argument. So how do you do that? So these are the 3 things we'll talk about in the next part. So let's start. The first thing is the identification of, do you really need a source, right, to make your argument? Now, what I want you to do is I want you to read this argument, and I want you to tell me, do you think that this is an unsubstantiated opinion, or do you think this is an informed argument? And if you think that it's not as substantiated as it should be, then can you point out what are the areas, what are the places in this paragraph where you need citations, where you need to look up sources and maybe see if the point is correct or not. So let me read it out. While institutions often police and strictly scrutinize students to prevent cases of plagiarism, it is not well understood how the experience of borrowing from a text is actually quite complex and may even have positive effects. So similar to what I think Shweta and some of you are also seeing, this whole idea of borrowing is something we do culturally. But here the point is how the experience of borrowing is complex, and may even have positive effects. Borrowing ideas from other texts in their own writing is how students learn to engage with new ideas. And if they're not learning to cite those ideas properly, it's a problem of academic literacy, not academic dishonesty. So this is, let's say, the argument that the author has presented. Now, would you believe this argument? Do you think it's justifiable, or do you think there are areas that need to be cited, or that need to be, like, where the information may be missing? And some of you may have attended the previous workshop, and we did an exercise similar to this, that are there premises that are not clear? Yeah, Gopal, go ahead.
So I do not agree with this, because I would say it's an unsubstantiated opinion, because they are talking about academic literacy, and they're talking about students who are being told, like, to interact with other ideas.
Okay, so you
still,
disagree with it. So you disagree with the idea. What I'm asking you is that suppose you are a teacher, right? And your student has written this. Now you want to give feedback to the student so that they can write a better argument. So you want them to show them, okay, maybe there are sections you can think more about. Maybe this part needs a little more corroboration. You need more evidence to prove this point. So what are some of these places where you would say that?
I would say that where they, state that may even have positive effects. So if
Okay.
it was a student, I would, ask for some studies, like at least one
Okay.
study to quote here, to
Okay,
cite here.
great. That's a great point. Because here you see that this author has claimed that experience of borrowing from a text may have positive effects. But one, hasn't spelled out what these positive effects are. So it just said may have positive effects, and you have to just believe that these are positive effects. Second, hasn't even cited one study to sort of show that, okay, other people have proved this. Vaishnavi, you want to add on?
So I wanted to say that I completely agree with this statement, because this thing that borrowing ideas from other texts is in their own writing is how students engage with new ideas. It's completely true. It's sometimes when we are actually reading a summary or an analysis, we read a line which is like, we realize that we actually didn't even look through the text that way. Like, it's a completely new dimension, or how somebody has thought about this idea, where we were not even we might not have understood that particular idea, or we might not have even thought of it. So it actually kind of helps sometimes, and we can then we realize that we also agree with that thought, so we can expand on that particular thing.
Okay, that's great. But Vaishnavi, what I will point out here is that suppose that's your experience, right? And maybe there are 5 other friends you have who have had the same experience, that by borrowing ideas from other texts, you learn to engage with new ideas just by the, let's say, act of copying, right? Even if you're copying somebody else's words, it's making you think about it. But is that true? Is that can that be generalized? Because you see that this sentence is being mentioned in a generalized way. So has there been some study through which this has been shown, right? Was there a survey through which this was shown, right? How do students learn to engage with new ideas? So again, when those details are missing, you are just thinking, okay, maybe this is true, but you still don't have enough evidence. Yeah, Shweta, you want to add on?
Yeah, thank you. So as you have rightly pointed out, I mean, understand many people here who point out about dishonesty, or the way even Gopal has mentioned it. But I think what we are missing out here is this restricts the something that is never been discussed. Like when literature started talking about women, I wonder if there were anything to cite, or when literature started talking about the subaltern experiences. I mean, what are you going to cite if it is a brand new experience? And how will we take it forward, the literature, if we do not have anything to cite? I mean, not everything can be cited, right? Yes, definitely we have to understand that how citation is important and how integrity plays a crucial role in this, but these are something that needs to be learned, that needs to be informed very well. And this is something, the gap where the academicians should work harder and more than putting all the thing on the students, because we are calling ourselves students for a reason, right? We are in the learning phase. When we are also doing PhDs, we are still learning, and what works in one space may not work in the other space, because we remember, like, citation, then references were so crucially important at one point, and now we hear about, okay, there is oral history coming up, there is a folklore coming up, so now where are we going with all this? So everything can't be actually cited. So what do about this? So where and how the new will emerge if everything has to be cited? That is my concern. Thank you.
So that's a very important point, right? Now, at any given time, not everything that you think you is true. And especially, let's say, taking the example of, let's say, subaltern or marginalized communities. Let's say there are communities who did not have access to formal educational spaces, right? Their knowledges have not been represented in text. There are still languages which don't have scripts, right? So there are languages which are just orally spoken. Now, how will you represent those knowledges, right? When it has not already been cited by others or has been recognized by others. So there is always that newness. Sometimes there is knowledge that you will kind of present that is new and you can't cite it. But at the same time, what we are trying to also understand is how do we then present that knowledge, right? So for example, if I am speaking from a personal experience, when I say that the experience of borrowing from a text is complex and has positive effects for me. Now, nobody knows about my experience or has positive effects for my community. Nobody knows about my community, and I'm presenting that knowledge, to society. But in this sentence, the issue is that it's presented perhaps as a generalized knowledge, which, the author is talking about authoritatively, as if it may even have positive effects, or in borrowing ideas from other texts in their own writing is how students learn to engage with new ideas. This is a very general statement, right? It's not about one person or a community. And it's also not spelling out what these are. So in such a situation, what I'm trying to say, citation is important to just establish the context from which you're starting, right?
If I may.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely correct in this being a slightly vague sentence, at the same time being very assertive with the way that the writer is actually saying that may have positive effects. But as you said, the positive effects are very vague. So it comes off as a person doesn't actually know what they're talking about. So adding a citation here would show that the person has an understanding of the subject itself, or what they're writing about.
Absolutely. But at the same time, let's keep in mind, I think the problem that Shweta pointed out, sometimes you may not have a citation and you are saying something entirely new, but that is also the space for research, for new research. That is also the space where perhaps, you have to take on the responsibility of presenting those claims and showing them to the world. Because, if you present your insight and your knowledge as an opinion, it takes time for it to get validated, right? So you have to think of how can I validate this so that I can persuade others, because you want others to engage with your knowledge also. Yeah, Subir?
Hi, Sayan. I think this problem, which I also posted in your box, was I've been struggling, and there have been many friends whom I know personally who have been struggling with this issue as to when to cite, when to quote, and use your own voice. Because ultimately, it's a very, and I think you mentioned something just now, which is about it takes time to develop that art. So I think it is an art which, which you develop over a period of time, but that's fine. As a person who has just stepped into this academic world, my PhD in 2012 from training. Now, I've faced this constant struggle as to what to cite, when to quote, and when to use my own voice. Even if I use my voice, it would be like paraphrasing, someone else's experience, or even if it is my experience, it has to do something which has happened in the past. So it's like a Rubik's puzzle, which you, engage with every time. Can you shed some light on that?
So I completely hear you. And again, I think this question is different for different disciplines, right? So for example, if you're working within, anthropology, right, where you are working on the ground, you're interviewing people, and let's say you also have to present your observations. Sometimes there is more scope to present your voice, your own emotional reflections, right? But let's say if you're working within the tradition of history, right? Sometimes it may not be possible to present your voice right at the beginning of your, academic journey, because you need to take time to think of, what your voice is, because this is an aesthetic question, right? It's about how do you want to use language in a manner that readers can feel something. But what you can work on is your argument, right? And so, for example, you can, by looking at this argument, so let's say if a student has written this argument, what you see on the screen, you can sort of start thinking of what are some of the areas that need to be supplemented, that will need perhaps a little more validation, or that will need to be rephrased, right? And that's how you work on the argumentation of it, right? Gopal, can you quickly make your point, and we'll then move on to the next bit.
Yeah, I just had one thing to point out how this is an unsubstantiated opinion. The last line is the one to note, because the problem of academic literacy versus academic dishonesty is actually an ongoing debate in research circles across disciplines. So this paragraph should have been in a neutral light, discussing both sides of the argument. And right now it's, asserting that it has positive effects and not, quoting and citing any of the other arguments or arguments from their, clan, I would say.
Okay, I completely hear you. And I think that what is required then is that, let's say, if I am making a judgment, I'm presenting a judgment that it's a problem of academic literacy, not academic dishonesty, then it is expected that in the next paragraph, I will start showing how, right? So if I've asserted this, I don't want the reader to just look at this as an opinion, right? I want to persuade them using reasons. So that is something that Gopal is pointing out. So if you look at this extract from the lens of, is it clear enough? Are some of these points generalizable, right? And if not, who does it exactly pertain to, right? Have there some studies been done? What does the author mean by positive effects? What does the author mean by academic literacy? Right? By asking those questions, you realize that this argument can be far more clearer, right? And citation has a role to play in improving the clarity. Now, this is actually like, this paragraph is taken from, this idea is taken from a book, right? Which is it's actually a PhD dissertation on plagiarism. And what the author is saying here is that, as we have suggested elsewhere, so the author starts with self-citation. So the author has already worked on this before and has written. The state of thinking on plagiarism is often caught between a culture of textual sampling and a culture of textual policing. A growing body of work has started to shed light on the complexities and issues that underlie textual borrowing. Right? So the author has used this phrase, a growing body of work. And at this point, as a reader, you're thinking, like, tell me, what is this growing body of work? Then the author goes on to say, research that has focused more closely on student writing motivation and development has shown that textual borrowing is more of an issue of academic literacy than academic dishonesty, and is therefore best viewed primarily as a developmental problem. And developmental problem means like how the student develops their own literacy and thinking. But at the same time, even here, it's actually presented as just an assertion, right? It's still not explained. So in that clarity, you still haven't achieved. There is a citation, but citation doesn't necessarily achieve that clarity. Now you're expecting the author will explain this further in the next paragraph. Indeed, copying or apparent plagiarism may constitute part of a successful developmental process. I think what some of you were also saying, that sometimes copying actually helps you engage with new ideas. In a similar vein, other work has pointed to the potential advantages of exploiting positive aspects of textual borrowing. Now, again, here it's not mentioned what these positive aspects are, but the author has put a lot of citations to show that, look, a lot of work has happened on this. However, as a critical reader, you would still want to, look up these and think that, okay, what are these positive aspects? So if you were writing this paragraph, you would need to cite in order to substantiate, but that doesn't complete your job, right? That just because you have cited doesn't mean you have managed to persuade. You also need to then think of, how do I provide more reasons for how it is an issue of academic literacy and academic dishonesty? How do I explain what are the positive aspects, right? So with those questions in mind, you move on in your writing. Now let's move to the next part, which is unpacking sources. Now, what does this mean? This means that any source that you use, right, is being published within a certain journal, let's say, or a certain publication. And here we're only talking about published sources. There are also sources that may be interviews and so on. But when you have a published source, how do you sort of try to think of the relevance and reliability of it? Now, one of the ways you do it is by first putting it down, right? So I have put it down in the MLA format. So in the MLA format, what is the information you need? The author's surname and name, right? You have the title of the essay, then the journal, the volume and issue number, date of publication, and page number, right? So this is the broad sort of like tradition. Now you notice in the previous text, right? It's written that has pointed to the potential advantages of exploiting positive aspects of textual borrowing, Pennycook, 1996, right? And in fact, it's this essay by Pennycook, which has been used. Now you want to understand as a critical reader, right? Suppose you are writing this argument and you want to use Pennycook, but you want to understand who is Alistair Pennycook. Should we believe him? Right? What tradition is he working within? So all of these questions are important too in your understanding of sources. Pennycook has also written about some of these ideas in other books. He's written a book called The Cultural Politics of English as an International Language. So you can get a sense of the broad tradition he's writing within. So just as, like a simple search will tell you that he's a linguist. He has been a teacher and a researcher for many decades. And currently he's a emeritus prof, which is a sort of senior professor of language, society and education at University of Technology, Sydney. He works in the areas of social linguistics, multilingualism, cultural politics of English. So for example, Alistair Pennycook is writing about something he works within, right? So one way in which you sort of assess the credibility of what somebody is saying, especially the research credibility, is whether they have been working in the tradition, for a while, and you realize that, okay, he's been working on cultural politics of English, he's working on multilingualism, he's talking about, different varieties of English and how they're used. So you realize, okay, that's the tradition. And he's also extensively cited already. So you think that, okay, his opinions are taken seriously also. You look at the journal, and TESOL Quarterly is actually a professional refereed journal, and it's an established journal that publishes articles on English language teaching. So the journal also is not some, random journal. It's a journal dedicated to writing about English language teaching and learning. Now, this is how you think about the context of the source, who the author is, what the journal is. You think, okay, this is reliable on the surface. But now, as I said before, you also have to look at the argument, right? And your judgment will be formed not just on the basis of this, but also on the basis of the argument that the author is presenting. Along with that, you also look at the method of argumentation. So let's say the author is making a point about how plagiarism is a cultural negotiation. Sorry, learning to cite, borrowing other words, right? It's a cultural negotiation where you are coming with certain linguistic knowledge. You are reading a new text which is written a little differently, and you're learning how to incorporate that language in your language, right? Now, this essay, how has Alistair Pennycook actually tried to present the points? He's done it through a study, right? So what is the method? So he's done ethnography, and ethnography means that he actually studied language practices in a university in Hong Kong, right? He looked at how undergraduate students are writing. He looked at teacher attitudes. He looked at their assignments. He interviewed them, right? And through that, he did an ethnography, but he combined it with a historical contextualization. So he also looked at how traditions of writing and borrowing from others have changed over the last 2 decades in particular, right? And how a notion of individualism has in fact become much stronger from, let's say the late 19th century or so, right? So So now you understand the method, and based on that, you form your judgment of the source. I think somebody had raised their hand. Prabjot, I didn't get your name. Do you want to say?
No, sorry, that was accidentally.
Okay, no worries. All right. So first we think of the need for citation. Where do we need to cite? Second, we identify sources and we look at them, we study them a little more carefully. And this is very important at a research level. And then we come to the writing aspect of it. Now, to address Subir's question, right? How do I figure out, where to paraphrase, where to quote? Now, one way to learn that is by reading existing, academic literature or any argument where people have cited. And what we want to do is we want to understand what are the different reasons they have cited and what are the choices they have made in their language. Now, we'll first look at this extract, right? So let me read it first. The appropriation of English necessarily has a profound impact on the identity of its users. In quotes, and this is where direct quotation is used, the world expressed and implied by English is clearly dramatically changing in some parts of the globe, though in vastly different ways for both colonized and colonizers. As Pennycook has argued, acts of language use, and again in quotes, acts of language use always imply a position within a social order, a cultural politics, a struggle over different representations of the self and other, right? So what we were also talking about in the previous part, that it's a cultural negotiation. In the context of post-colonialism and indigenous writing, right, writing done by indigenous sort of ethnic groups, Narogian highlights the kinds of difficulties faced by indigenous Australian writers who submit their work to publishing houses that require authors to edit their work according to the practices and conventions of standard Australian English. So this is in the context of Australia. Now, I want you to think of each sort of quote and each area where a source has been used and tell me, what do you think this is doing? What is the function of it? So let's look at the first one, and you can put down your responses on chat or raise your hand. The appropriation of English, or how you have used and taken and used English, necessarily has a profound impact on the identity of its users. The world expressed and implied by English is clearly dramatically changing in some parts of the globe, though in vastly different ways. Yeah, for both colonized and colonizers. Why do you think this quote has been used? What is the point of it? Anything that comes to your mind, put it down. Shweta, I'll come to you. I just want to, maybe some of you can put it down on chat. I'm not able to see the chat box at the moment. 1 second.
There's no response at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Shweta, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to respond to your question. So I think he's using this first expression is to confirm the next statement that he's about to use for how indigenous people struggle and what are, how the politics of literature.
Okay, but if we just focus on this one, the world expressed and implied, right? So if he hadn't used the quote, would that have made a difference? So the world expressed and implied. So whatever world, so when I'm using English, I am referring to a certain set of social assumptions, right?
Right.
Right. So the author could have just said it, the world expressed and implied by English is clearly changing. But why does it need to be in quotes?
Yeah, so this gives emphasis on how the first author, that Fanon, must have struggled, personally experienced, and then expressed his experiences of experiencing English and the academia. And that emphasizes that and establishes the fact that the worlds expressed and implied are different.
Okay. Subir, do you want to add on to that?
I just wanted to know and clarify if this quote is kind of a self-decision that we make, writing process. Because I could have easily, skipped Fanon.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because this is not something which is very technical.
Yeah.
It's coming from a person who said it, for the first time. Something which we gather, which we grow up with. So, yeah, in that sense, it is also kind of a self-decision that we make when we are quoting something which is, and very precisely when you, when someone has mentioned about the world expressed and implied. So, yeah, just wanted to add that.
So this is a decision, it's a stylistic choice. Gopal, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think like these quotes are important here in this line, because the author is clearly going to use quotes to, kind of defend this line and to add on to the argument. So these quotes kind of differentiate this line from a mere opinion to a thing that has been discussed in the past in the works and has been observed in the real world. So it's not just a mere opinion or an assertion that the author has made. It has been like this discussed in the past.
Okay. No, that's a good point. But I want to say that, the author could have just not used the quote here and written the world expressed and implied by English is clearly dramatically changing without the quotes. And then in the next sentence, as Pennycook has argued. So Pennycook is being used to actually support and illustrate, right? So it's like you present what feels like an opinion. And then in the next sentence, you say, as X author has argued and also validated and supported this idea, you mention it. Now, one of the things to understand, and I think Subir is sort of, has really caught on to it. Frantz Fanon is an author, and this is where looking at who the author is becomes important, is somebody who's actually worked on, colonization and the effects it has, right? Also on language and identity and psychology, right? Frantz Fanon, famously wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth. And he had, he wrote about, the Algeria, colonization of Algeria by France and the kinds of effects that it had on people. So, but also along with that, along with the context of colonization, there is also this idea, the world expressed and implied. So Fanon has come up with a concept. Sometimes, you come up with a concept that a language expresses a world, right? Say, and Fanon popularized this concept, right? So you are using this concept, but this concept has been taken from Fanon. So you directly use that phrase to use that concept. With regard to the next, quote, as Pennycook has argued, as I already said, it is being used to illustrate. But my question here is that, why do you think this quote is so long? Right? So it said acts of language use always imply a position within a social order, a cultural politics, a struggle over different representations of the self and other. Why do you think all of this needed to be said? Is there any, what do you think? So people can put it down on chat, whatever comes to your mind. Yeah, Gopal, go ahead.
I think even changing one word here would change the meaning. So I guess they wanted the full spirit of the sentence. So they kind of put it right here.
So sometimes, you will, when you are citing, and many of you have mentioned this, is sometimes, the author has already said, what you have to say, right? You feel that, author has already said it so beautifully and has talked about all the different parts of this idea. And suppose the author has also presented it in this sentence, which summarizes all of those different parts, right? And then it makes sense to actually use the entirety of that quote, right? So as a result, as a reader, you think of how acts of language, when we think of how English expresses the world, right? How it shows us a certain attitude towards society. It has many more aspects to it. It's about your position within the social order, right? Your class, caste, gender, position. It refers to a cultural politics. You're coming from a certain regional culture. There's somebody who's coming from another culture. What is the conversation or negotiation you have? Struggle over different representations of the self and other. right? How are you trying to describe yourself in the language? How are you describing another person in the language? So all of these issues can be mentioned in this one line, right? Now, it's possible that the author will now take on these, issues later in the argument. Let's look at the third one. In the context of post-colonialism and indigenous writing, Narogin highlights the kinds of difficulties faced by indigenous Australian writers who submit their work to publishing houses that require authors to edit their work according to the practices and conventions of standard Australian English. Now, the difference you find here is that it's paraphrased entirely, right? So unlike the previous two, which were direct quotations, this is a paraphrased argument. What do you think is the function of this? Why is it being used? Any thoughts? Yeah, so put down your responses on chat, whatever comes to your mind. It is providing an example, okay. Mohini, you want to say something?
Yes, so this actually, paraphrasing here actually just showcases that the writer has actually what his thoughts are on what the actual quotation actually meant. Like this is what his take is on the quotation or the work. What ideas were inspired by the quotation itself.
Okay, so that's a good point. So, the first part, right, is giving a general introduction, right? It's saying that how English has impacted users, how there are cultural politics over English, it's changing in different parts of the globe, right? Now, these are very broad points. This could apply to 100,000 different contexts. But the author obviously now is using one context or one example, in order to now illustrate, right? And as, Mohini and as Vanshika, are saying, the author is now sort of actually showing the application of the broad framing, which you saw in the previous paragraph. And what is the application? That in the context of post-colonial indigenous writing, that there are difficulties that are faced by indigenous Australian writers because they are writing in a language that is, let's say, their own, but they have to, change their language to what is standard Australian English. Just like, you write in Indian Englishes, but you have to change it to, let's say, a British English because it needs to be published by some, publication house, right? And that is the cultural negotiation and the power play that the author is now talking about. So paraphrasing text allows more flexibility of the concept. So another thing to notice here, why is this being paraphrased? This is being paraphrased because this is actually a pretty long argument, right? So Narogin may have written about this in one full essay, and you have to just take the summary of that and present it, right? So then paraphrasing really helps you. Vanshika, did you want to add something?
Yes, this might be something less significant also, but the need here to paraphrase is also because earlier we have seen that the author has directly used the words of other authors. He has quoted, but here paraphrasing is showing the readers that he's not only just citing, but he's also using his own voice to express his opinion.
Yes, and I think Subir has mentioned this too. So this is another function, right? So here, you are also presenting your own voice rather than just sort of using direct quotations. Now, I have sort of, I put it down that the first one has to do with, it's a concept that is being used to indicate the function of the English language. Second one, to illustrate and explicate the previous point. So frequently we'll use words like as, thus, or it has been pointed out by, right? And finally, it is contextualizing the broader argument through a specific example. So these are three functions, right, that you will popularly find in a lot of writing. So since we don't have a lot of time, I want to do another exercise, but like a similar exercise. But what I want to emphasize is that keep this in mind, right? That in this case, in this extract, for example, when we say, the author is saying plagiarism, Coleridge suggests, is a highly emotional subject and the issue of how to deal with it seems muddled by moral confusion. The function is definitional. Sometimes you use a quote to define a concept first. to set the ground before you move on to it, right? And then again, in Descartes' study, an example is being used to prove or validate that point, right? The final thing we'll do, and we'll just take 5 minutes and then wrap up, is to now think of the rhetoric or the language that you use in order to connect citations. So we have talked about the functions of these citations, what the functions can be. And the more you read and the longer text you read, you realize there can be 20 different functions, right? Illustration, contextualizing, definition, using a concept, supporting examples, right? Sometimes counter arguments, contrasting the point, right? There are different functions. Now, I want you to read these 2 paragraphs. I'll read the first one, and then I want you to read the second one and think of the blanks, which are the connecting phrases. So let's read it. The growing consensus of opinion that plagiarism is a cross-cultural phenomenon recognizes the hidden influence of culture and context-related factors on the self as author in making explicit that the words being used are not his or her own, right? So basically, the idea that that there are many cultural factors which makes the author sort of realize, or which makes it explicit that the words being used by the author are not their own. In their survey of 645 international students, now you see that now think about it. What is the function of this? The function of this is actually to try to validate or justify the previous point. So in their survey of 645 international students, Rusikov and others et al. Dash that plagiarism has often been an outgrowth of difference in understanding. That you don't understand the cultural practices, right? What we were talking about earlier, you're adjusting to a new writing practice. So here, the verb, what would it be? What do you think? Assert, showed, good. So it's a word that's about proving this point, right? Showing this point. I'll come to your question, Subhi. But the actual word that is used is concluded, right? So let me just actually show it to you here. Yeah. So the word that would be used here, that was used in the original essay, was concluded, but asserted could also work. Concluded is more specific because this was a study and a survey was done and the survey had some conclusions. Now let's look at the next one. Pennycook and Soden argues that plagiarism is culturally conditioned and thus is interpreted differently across cultures. Now, what do you think is the transition or the connecting word here? The first paragraph has given the broad idea that it's about difference in cultural understanding. The next paragraph sentence actually starts with a similar idea. So what would be said here? Vanshika said as. What else? Similarly is better, right? So actually the original is in a similar vein, or similarly can also work, right? Similarly, Pennycook and Soden argue that plagiarism is culturally conditioned and thus is interpreted differently across cultures. Pennycook dash the complex content of plagiarism, arguing that notions of ownership, authorship, and intellectual property, which have developed in the Western context, are subject to the distinct cultural and historical specificities. So the same idea is being elaborated. But what should be the verb here then? Pennycook dash. What is Pennycook doing here? Stresses, okay, can work. Emphasizes on, points to, absolutely. Right, so it's Pennycook points out. So that's the original. Now, this is also very useful and important to keep in mind, that when you now are sort of putting together the citations, you have to think of the words. Frequently, I find that students don't know how to introduce the citation. So it's abrupt, right? You begin with a quote rather than having a connecting phrase, which will logically sort of connect the different sentences and different ideas, which may include your own voice and own claims as well as the quotes, right? So that's sort of the third and final thing I wanted to do as part of what we need to keep in mind while citing. And if I may take sort of one more minute, I just wanted to point out, this is something you can look up. This is just a technical detail. But something to keep in mind when you're doing research work is the type of source you're using. And we talked about how sources are produced from different disciplines. There is some sources have more authority, how we read and find out the, which institution it's coming from. But we also have to think of the type of source it is in terms of how the knowledge has been gathered. So we make this distinction between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. So primary sources usually mean first-hand or contemporary accounts. So something like a letter, like a diary, right? An interview. It's a primary source because you're directly hearing it from the person who is producing that knowledge, right? Even let's say a lab experiment that you do and you observe, what is happening. Secondary sources would be, let's say, a lot of scholarship, a lot of criticism that you read, which are using primary sources. It's using the novel to offer an interpretation or analysis, right? And finally, tertiary source is where you have a summary of a secondary source, right? But let's say you would go to Wikipedia and Spark Notes. The reason we say that it could be unreliable is because, we don't always know if those summaries are correct. So because we haven't, read the actual text. So this is some basic sort of jargon. And I will also send you a lot of stuff that will help you think about sources and plagiarism more. I'll do it, tomorrow or the day after. And Shrimi will, I think, forward that. So that's it in terms of the overall workshop. If you have any questions, maybe can we take some questions, Shrimi?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
I had one. Sorry for this interruption.
Yes.
Hi, Sayan.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, hi. So there are many times when instead of interviews, we enter into a conversation. Conversations on kind of informal mode. So let's say I have a conversation with a scholar who's based either in India or outside, but it is on Twitter, let's say on Twitter or Facebook. So can that be taken as a primary source? And if so, then how do I cite that?
So
it is not an interview, it is just a conversation.
So any conversation that is documented, right? So for example, let's say I've had a conversation with you. Suppose this video was not being recorded. And at some point I said that, oh, Subir asked me this question. It is more unreliable because the reader has to, trust my memory and has to trust that I'm saying the truth when I say that Subir said this to me. But if it is documented, if it is recorded, right, then there is a tangible proof that this was said. Now, let's say even if it's informal, you can use it as a source, but keep in mind that a Twitter conversation is not equivalent to a research journal article, right?
Oh, certainly, I do agree.
So as long as you keep that in mind, you can definitely use the source. So there is no source that you cannot use, right? As we started in that spirit, that all our knowledge is actually based on sources. Our job is to identify what are those sources, which have more power, which have less power, and why. We have to understand how to use those sources in conversation, and then we come to the task of learning the techniques of citation for academic presentation of that content. Yeah. Mohini, did you have a question or is your hand raised?
Oh, no, my mistake, sorry.
No problem. Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah, Gopal.
Sometimes like we have an assignment where we have to, back up one side of the argument. But sometimes what happens is there are very weak sources or like from journals that are not well known and have been in issues of like plagiarism and other stuff. So what do we do in this case? Like we still have to do the argument and we still have to do the assignment, but we have weak sources.
See, I mean, so this is an interesting question. So when you're saying weak sources, you mean that the sources may just be, let's say, an informal article or an opinion piece, right? So they may not be a well-researched journal article. Is that what you mean?
Not from like there is an impact rating of every journal. So
okay, like that.
Yeah.
Okay, see, this is why I said that, okay, sometimes the source you are taking, it may not be published in a journal of high impact, because today, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, I mean, the good thing is that today knowledge is democratized to the extent that so many people are participating in conversation. But unfortunately, all of us don't have access, to all the journals, right? Even if we want to publish in some, so frequently publications can happen through networks and all of that, right? So it's not possible always to publish in, let's say, high impact journals. So I think what you need to do, you need to make your judgment, right? So what I said, 2 factors you keep in mind is the authority of the publisher, the journal, the authority of the author, right? Let's say, I just finished my PhD and I published something. I don't have, 30 publications behind me. So in that sense, I may not have too much authority. But even despite that, you can look at the arguments. You can see if it's persuasive, and very importantly, you will try to corroborate them in other places. And suppose you still find that, okay, it's not well corroborated. You have to keep that in mind. You have to keep that in mind that what I'm citing it may be a very important perspective, but I have to read up more to be sure about it, right? So you have to sort of maybe write with a little more tentativeness then, right? Does that make sense, Gopal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There's a question, Sayan, publishing, this is from Charanjit Singh. Publishing the chapters from own PhD thesis in the form of article, does it fall under plagiarized? I think this is a very, very common question. Does that count as self-plagiarism?
No, so actually people do that. They do publish their chapters. But what happens is that you usually sort of update the chapters, right? And remember that your PhD is already being published. Let's say on, a public forum, eGyan Kosh, for example, not eGyan Kosh, Shodh Ganga, right, might sort of already publish. So if your PhD is already published, what you need to do is when you're publishing your chapter, you need to mention this. You need to mention that this is a revised or updated version of, a PhD chapter that you wrote. In fact, you will find that many writers, they update essays that they wrote, previously in books. Sometimes people have written, 10 different essays in 10 different books, and at some point they compile it into one book, right? So it's not that you can't do it, but you have to acknowledge that this was already published as a PhD. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's time. Can't see any more questions here. Just lots of thank yous to Sayan for the wonderful session, definitely. I would like to invite Professor Mangalam to render the final vote of thanks to our speaker for the day. Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Shrimi, and real, heartfelt thanks to Sayan for a very lucid and a very comprehensive kind of, engagement with this topic, a much needed one by scholars at all levels, right from students to, PhD scholars. So it's a very, very valuable, add-on today, whatever you discussed, especially the question of, relating plagiarism to a cultural context. So very interesting insights and very useful, tips also to scholars. And thank you. And please do come back to us on different topics again of, equal scholarship. Thank you, everyone. And our thanks to the participants as well, and to Shrimi and Madhulika for organizing this workshop. So good.
Thank you, ma'am.